The rain pounded relentlessly against the tin roof of Daniel Carter's auto repair shop, the storm seeming to mirror the chaos of his own thoughts. He wiped his hands on a rag, glancing at the clock mounted above the garage door. Midnight had come and gone, and it was time to lock up. Yet something gnawed at him, a strange tension in the air, as if the night itself was holding its breath. He moved to the door, keys jingling in his hand, when the sound stopped him cold. It wasn't thunder, though the storm provided ample cover for it. It was sharper, more deliberate, like metal groaning under immense pressure. The sound seemed to echo through the forest beyond his shop, pulling him toward the dark expanse like an invisible tether. Curiosity wrestled with caution as he grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the downpour. The beam cut through sheets of rain, illuminating the muddy trail leading into the trees. His boots sank into the soft earth as he trudged forward, each step accompanied by the drum beat of his heart. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, a crash, as if something enormous had plummeted from the sky. He pushed through the undergrowth, the storm swallowing the crunch of branches underfoot. When his flashlight fell on the wreckage, he froze. It was like nothing he'd ever seen, sleek, metallic, and utterly alien. The craft's surface glowed faintly, its edges marred by scorch marks and jagged tears. Steam hissed from its wounds, rising like ghosts into the stormy night. And then he saw her. The figure emerged from the shadows, her form unmistakably humanoid but impossibly otherworldly. Her skin shimmered a deep, iridescent blue, rainwater cascading over her in streams that caught the faint light. Dark eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through him. She staggered, clutching her side, and Daniel could see a jagged wound seeping a strange, silvery liquid. "Human," she said, her voice low but resonant, carrying over the storm like a command. "Help me." It wasn't a plea. It was an order, and for a moment Daniel couldn't move. His mind raced, screaming that this wasn't real, that aliens didn't exist, at least not outside the realm of science fiction. Yet here she was, bleeding and barking demands as if she had every right to. "Are you hurt?" He managed to ask, his voice rough with disbelief. Her glare was sharp enough to cut through his hesitation. "Obviously," she snapped, but her legs buckled before she could say more. Instinct took over, and he lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Her skin was warm, softer than he expected, and beneath the commanding aura, she trembled, her strength fading fast. She tried to push him away, her pride refusing to yield, but her body betrayed her. He hoisted her into his arms, surprised by the weight of her despite her lithe frame, and carried her back toward the garage. The storm swallowed them, rain pouring down in torrents as he stumbled through the mud. Inside the garage, he laid her on a worn cot, sweeping tools and spare parts onto the floor in a flurry of motion. He grabbed a blanket and draped it over her, watching as she curled into it with wary eyes. Her gaze flickered around the space, taking in every detail with a sharp, calculating look that made it clear she wasn't used to being vulnerable. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He crouched beside her, gripping the flashlight tightly as if it might ward off the strangeness of the situation. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she assessed him with a piercing stare, as if deciding whether he was worth her time. "Laura," she said finally, "and if you want to live, you'll keep your questions to yourself." The faint hum of distant engines reached his ears, making her tense. Her posture shifted despite her injury, becoming something predatory and ready to strike. "They found me," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Who?" Daniel demanded, his voice rising in urgency. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath the iron exterior. "The Syndicate," she said, "and if they catch me, they'll kill us both." Before he could press her further, her strength gave out completely. Her body went limp, and her breathing evened into unconsciousness. Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. The name meant nothing to him, but the fear in her voice had been real. Whoever these people or beings were, they were close, and they were dangerous. He grabbed a tarp and headed back into the storm. The wreckage couldn't stay out in the open, it was too exposed. Camouflaging it with branches and debris from the forest, he worked as quickly as he could, the rain masking the sound of his movements. Just as he finished, the hum of engines grew louder. Lights flickered through the trees, moving in a deliberate pattern that sent a chill down his spine. Daniel ducked behind a tree, heart pounding. The figures that moved through the forest were humanoid in shape, but unnervingly mechanical in their movements. Their glowing visors swept the area with surgical precision, searching for any sign of Laura or the craft. One figure paused, its visor scanning dangerously close to Daniel's hiding spot. He held his breath, gripping a rock in case he had to defend himself. After an agonizing moment, the figure moved on, and the group disappeared into the storm. Daniel waited until he was sure the coast was clear before sprinting back to the garage. Locking the doors behind him, he slumped into a chair, soaked to the bone and overwhelmed by the insanity of the night. Laura stirred on the cot, her dark eyes fluttering open. She sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "My workshop," Daniel replied, standing. "You fainted." Her gaze sharpened as her memory returned. "The syndicate," she said, trying to rise. "They're gone for now," Daniel said, gently pressing her back down. "You need to rest." She glared at him but didn't resist. "Why did you hide me?" "Why wouldn't I?" he shot back. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Humans are selfish creatures. You owe me nothing, yet you risk your life to protect me." Daniel crossed his arms, meeting her gaze. "You're not exactly in a position to judge." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I had no choice," she admitted. "If I stayed in my ship, they would have found me." He leaned against the wall, his mind still spinning. "And who exactly are they?" Her expression darkened. "The Syndicate is a regime that controls my world." "I disobeyed them." "That's vague," he said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I stole something," she said after a pause, her voice quiet but laced with defiance. "Something they want back." The weight of her words hung heavy between them, and Daniel knew his life had just been irrevocably changed. The first rays of dawn barely cut through the rain-soaked windows of Daniel's workshop, yet the tension in the air hadn't eased. Laura sat perched on the edge of the cot, her dark eyes locked on the garage door, as if sheer will could keep it from bursting open. Daniel, leaning against his workbench, stared at the tools scattered in front of him, but wasn't seeing them. His mind raced with questions he didn't know how to ask, and answers he doubted he wanted to hear. The silence between them felt as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at the slightest misstep. Finally, Daniel broke it. "You've got to give me more than vague warnings and shadowy enemies. Who are these syndicate people, and why are they hunting you like a dog?" Laura's head snapped toward him, her posture rigid. "They're not people, not entirely. They're an empire brutal, efficient, and relentless. They enslave planets, strip them of resources, and crush anyone who dares resist." Her voice was clipped, controlled, but Daniel caught the faintest quiver in her tone. "And you resisted," he pressed, crossing his arms. "What? You just woke up one day and decided to take on a galactic empire single-handedly?" Her lips twitched in what might have been the shadow of a smile, though it was gone as quickly as it came. "Something like that. It wasn't just one day, it was years of watching my people suffer while the syndicate grew fat on our labor. They don't leave survivors, Daniel. They leave obedient tools, and I wasn't willing to be one." He didn't reply right away, letting her words settle. The weight of them, the sheer scope of what she described, felt impossible to grasp. Yet here she was, a living, breathing piece of a war he couldn't comprehend, sitting on his cot in a shabby workshop. "So what did you take?" he finally asked. "The proof of their crimes," Lara said, her gaze hardening. "Data, documents, communications, everything they never wanted anyone to see. It's all stored in a device I barely managed to smuggle out. With it, the rebellion has a chance to expose them, to bring their empire to its knees." Daniel let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "And now they're chasing you halfway across the galaxy to get it back." "That's the gist of it," she said, her voice flat. Before he could respond, a faint hum filled the air, a sound so low and distant that he wasn't sure he'd heard it at all. Lara stiffened, her head tilting as if she could sense something he couldn't. "They're close," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The syndicate scouts." Daniel moved to the window, peeking through the blinds. The woods beyond were still shrouded in mist, the ground slick with mud. He couldn't see anything, but the unease in Laura's expression was enough to set him on edge. "Get down," she ordered, dragging herself off the cot despite the pain etched across her face. "They'll scan the area first. We can't let them find us." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He followed her lead, crouching low as she grabbed a small device from her belt, a sleek, alien contraption he couldn't begin to understand. She pressed a sequence of buttons, and the device emitted a soft pulse before falling silent. "What's that supposed to do?" he whispered. "Disrupt their sensors," she replied, wincing as she leaned against the wall. "It won't last long, but it'll buy us time." Time for what? Daniel didn't ask. He didn't want to hear the answer. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited in tense silence. The hum grew louder, closer, until it seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then the lights came, thin beams cutting through the mist, moving in deliberate, methodical patterns. Daniel's pulse quickened as he glimpsed the source. Figures with sleek, metallic armor, their movements unnervingly smooth, almost mechanical. Laura tensed beside him, her hand tightening on the edge of the workbench. "They're drones," she said softly. "Controlled by operators, fast, ruthless, and deadly." "Great," Daniel muttered under his breath. "Any chance they'll just get bored and leave?" She shot him a sharp look. "Not likely." One of the drones paused, its visor scanning the garage's exterior. The beam of light passed over the walls, lingered for a moment on the windows, then moved on. Daniel barely breathed, his fingers gripping the handle of a wrench like it was a lifeline. The drone moved on, and the lights faded into the trees. But the tension didn't ease. "They'll be back," Laura said grimly. "Once they finish their first sweep, they'll come for the crash site. They won't stop until they've found the device." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. "Then we need to move it, hide it somewhere they can't find it." Lara hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she weighed the risk. "It's dangerous to move it too far," she said finally. "The more we expose ourselves, the more chances they have to track us, and staying here is a death sentence," he countered. "So unless you've got a better idea," she cut him off with a curt nod. "Fine, but we'll need to act fast." They worked in silence, Laura guiding him as he packed the alien device into a metal case and loaded it into the back of his old pickup truck. Every movement felt like a gamble, every sound like a beacon drawing their enemies closer. By the time they were ready to leave, the mist had begun to lift, revealing more of the forest's dense undergrowth. Laura climbed into the passenger seat, her posture tense, her gaze scanning the tree line as if expecting the drones to emerge at any moment. Daniel started the engine, the familiar rumble of the truck oddly comforting amid the chaos. "Where to?" he asked. "Somewhere remote," she said. "Somewhere they won't think to look." "That narrows it down," he muttered, pulling onto the muddy trail that led away from the shop. The road was rough, the truck bouncing and skidding as they navigated deeper into the woods. The hum of the drones was faint now, distant but ever present, like a predator stalking its prey. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white as he focused on the path ahead. Lara remained silent, her hand resting protectively on the case between them. For a moment, he glanced at her, his voice softer than before. "Why me? Why stop at my shop? You didn't know I'd help you." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "But I'm beginning to think I made the right one." It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him driving. The forest swallowed them whole, the dense canopy above casting flickering shadows across the narrow dirt trail. The pickup truck groaned under the strain of the uneven road, its tires kicking up mud as Daniel gripped the wheel. Every glance at the rearview mirror was filled with unease, his heart racing at the thought of those drones returning. Beside him, Laura sat rigid, the metal case clutched tightly in her lap. The hum of the truck's engine filled the silence, but it couldn't drown out the tension hanging between them. As they reached a fork in the trail, Daniel slowed the truck. He glanced at her, his jaw tight. "Where exactly are we going? Or are we just driving until we run out of gas?" Laura hesitated, her gaze darting to the dark woods ahead. "There's no perfect plan. Anywhere remote gives us a chance to think and figure out our next move." "A chance?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "We're winging it with galactic assassins breathing down our necks." Her eyes met his, sharp and unyielding. "Do you have a better idea?" The tension between them crackled like static, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. He tightened his grip on the wheel, muttering, "Didn't think so," before veering left down the less trodden path. The truck lurched forward, its engine struggling to navigate the steep incline ahead. Lura's fingers tapped anxiously on the metal case, the rhythmic sound mirroring the erratic beat of Daniel's thoughts. Every bump in the road felt like a countdown to disaster. Then, without warning, the hum returned. Low and faint at first, it grew louder, more insistent, until it was unmistakable. Daniel's stomach dropped as a flicker of light appeared in the distance behind them, weaving through the trees like a predator stalking its prey. "They found us," Laura said, her voice clipped but calm. She twisted in her seat, her eyes scanning the approaching lights. "Drive faster. This old thing wasn't built for speed," he snapped, but his foot slammed down on the gas pedal anyway. The truck surged forward, its engine roaring in protest. The lights behind them multiplied, their movements unnervingly precise as they closed the distance. Lara turned her attention to the case, flipping it open to reveal a small, sleek device glowing with a faint blue light. She pressed a series of buttons with practiced ease, the device emitting a pulse that rippled through the air. "What are you doing?" Daniel barked, his knuckles white as he wrestled with the wheel to keep the truck on course. "Buying us time," she replied, her focus unshaken. The pulse grew stronger, the lights behind them faltering momentarily as the drones adjusted to the disruption. The temporary reprieve was enough for Daniel to swerve off the trail, plunging the truck into the dense undergrowth. Branches scraped against the windows, the tires struggling for traction as he maneuvered through the uneven terrain. The hum of the drones grew faint, but Daniel knew better than to believe they'd lost them for good. He brought the truck to a sudden halt, killing the engine. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. Lara's fingers hovered over the device, her gaze fixed on the forest beyond. "They'll recalibrate and find us again," she said, her voice low but resolute. "We need to move on foot." "Move where?" Daniel demanded, his frustration boiling over. "They've got tech that can scan the entire area. What chance do we have against that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she climbed out of the truck, the case tucked securely under her arm. "We don't fight them head on," she said, meeting his eyes with steely determination. "We outsmart them." Her confidence was maddening, but he followed her lead, grabbing what little gear they had and plunging into the forest. The terrain was unforgiving, every step a struggle as they navigated through the thick underbrush. The darkness around them felt alive, every rustle of leaves or crack of branches setting Daniel's nerves on edge. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing with a small, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. The structure was dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect, but it offered a semblance of shelter. "This will do," Laura said, stepping inside without hesitation. Daniel followed, dropping his pack onto the rickety table in the center of the room. "Do for what? Waiting around to die?" "For preparing," she replied, already scanning the space for anything useful. Her movements were efficient, methodical, as if she'd done this 100 times before. "We won't get another chance to regroup." He couldn't argue with that. As much as he hated to admit it, she had a way of cutting through his cynicism with brutal pragmatism. He watched as she set the case down, the device inside casting an eerie glow that illuminated her features. For a moment, she looked almost human except for the weight of galaxies reflected in her eyes. "You know," he said, his voice softer than before, "you never really answered my question back there. Why me? Why stop at my shop?" Her hands stilled, and for the first time she seemed to falter. "I didn't stop at your shop," she said quietly. "I crashed, and you were the one who found me." The only one who didn't run. There was a vulnerability in her words that caught him off guard, but before he could respond, the hum returned closer, louder, and more insistent than ever. "They're here," she said, her voice tight. Daniel grabbed a wrench from the table, his pulse pounding. "And what's the plan this time, genius?" Laura's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, her eyes blazing with determination. "We fight." The hum of the drones grew louder, reverberating through the stillness of the forest like a warning drumbeat. Daniel's grip tightened on the wrench in his hand, the cold metal a poor substitute for a real weapon. Beside him, Laura crouched near the cabin's window, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the device in her lap. Her focus was razor sharp, her hands deftly working over its surface, inputting commands that Daniel could only guess at. "They're closing in," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. Her expression grim. "They'll sweep the area first. When they don't find us outside, they'll breach." Daniel's jaw clenched as he glanced around the tiny cabin. It was a dead end, a flimsy shelter at best. "We can't hold out here." "This place is a trap, I know," she said, her fingers still flying over the device's controls, "but we don't need to hold out for long." Just enough to throw them off. Her calmness in the face of certain danger infuriated him, but he couldn't deny the clarity of her strategy. She wasn't thinking in terms of survival, she was thinking in terms of winning. It was a mindset he wasn't used to, and it left him feeling a step behind. Still, he couldn't abandon her now, not after everything they'd been through. The lights appeared first, thin beams piercing the trees as the drones emerged from the shadows. Their movements were precise, their glowing visors scanning every inch of the clearing. Daniel's grip on the wrench tightened as one of them paused near the cabin, its head swiveling unnaturally as if sensing their presence. "Almost there," Laura murmured, her voice steady despite the tension thick in the air. The drone took a step closer, its metallic body gleaming under the pale moonlight. Daniel's pulse quickened. "We don't have much time." Laura pressed one final command into the device and snapped it shut. "Now," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Get to the truck." "What?" he hissed, his eyes darting to the door. "That thing's useless if they see us leaving." "They won't," she said, grabbing the device and slipping it into her pack. "Not if we make them look somewhere else." Before he could argue, she pulled a small cylindrical object from her belt and threw it out the window. It landed with a faint clink in the underbrush, emitting a sharp, high-pitched pulse. The drones immediately shifted their focus, their visors glowing brighter as they converged on the source of the sound. Daniel didn't wait to question her plan. He bolted for the truck, wrench in hand, with Laura close behind. The moment they reached the vehicle, she threw herself into the passenger seat, the pack clutched tightly against her chest. Daniel slid behind the wheel, starting the engine with a roar that seemed deafening against the stillness of the night. "Go!" Laura barked, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The truck shot forward, tearing through the dense forest as branches whipped against its sides. The drones, distracted by the decoy, didn't immediately pursue, but Daniel knew it wouldn't take them long to recalibrate. The truck barreled down the rough trail, its tires skidding on the muddy ground as he pushed it to its limits. "What's the plan?" "Laura," he shouted over the roar of the engine. "Get to the ridge," she said, her voice sharp. "There's a cave system on the other side. It'll block their sensors." He didn't ask how she knew about the caves. At this point, he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between them and the Syndicate's hunters. The truck bounced violently as they hit a rocky incline, the engine groaning in protest. Behind them, the hum of the drones returned, louder and more insistent. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror and cursed under his breath. The lights were back, weaving through the trees like fireflies with deadly purpose. "They're gaining on us," he yelled. Laura leaned out the window, her arm outstretched as she activated another device from her pack. A pulse of blue light shot out, momentarily blinding the drones and causing them to veer off course. But it wouldn't hold them for long. "Faster, Daniel," she urged. "I'm going as fast as this thing will go," he shot back, the frustration and adrenaline mixing in his voice. The ridge came into view, a jagged line against the night sky. Daniel pushed the truck harder, the tires skidding as they crested the hill. The cave entrance loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was their only chance. He drove straight for it, slamming the brakes just as they reached the opening. "Out!" Laura shouted, already leaping from the truck with the pack in hand. Daniel followed, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they darted into the cave. The air was damp and cold, the walls slick with moisture. Laura led the way, her steps sure despite the darkness. They didn't stop until the hum of the drones faded, replaced by the echoing silence of the cavern. Daniel collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. "Please tell me you have an actual plan this time." Laura crouched beside him, her expression weary but determined. "We wait for the drones to pass, then we move." "To where?" he asked, his voice tinged with exasperation. "We can't keep running forever," she hesitated, her gaze flickering to the pack. "We won't have to. Once I get this to my allies, it'll all be over. And if you don't," he pressed. Her silence was answer enough. They sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, the tension between them thick but unspoken. Finally, Laura broke the silence, her voice softer than before. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." He looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess." She smiled faintly, a rare glimpse of vulnerability breaking through her steely exterior. "We will be, I promise." Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep into the cave, casting long shadows across the walls. The Syndicate's drones had moved on, their search focused elsewhere. For now, they were safe. But Daniel knew the fight was far from over. As they prepared to move again, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them both. The syndicate wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, but neither would Laura, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Daniel knew he'd stand by her side until the very end.